In every single presidential election in the United States, there is always one true winner, regardless of who the candidate is. That is Wall Street, the U.S. financial services industry, including large banks and investment funds and asset managers, most of which are located in New York. In every single presidential election in the U.S., Wall Street is always one of the largest funders of the political campaigns of both candidates from the Republican and Democratic parties. And the 2024 election is no exception. Donald Trump portrays himself as a so-called anti-establishment candidate, and his supporters claim that he is going to change the status quo. But in reality, just like Joe Biden, Donald Trump is being funded by Wall Street. And this May, it was revealed that the CEO of the world's largest landlord is funding Donald Trump's campaign. I am talking about Blackstone, which is one of the world's largest asset managers, and it is the largest commercial landlord in human history. On its website, Blackstone proudly describes itself as, quote, the world's largest alternative asset manager with more than $1 trillion in assets under management. And in its portfolio, it owns 12,500 real estate assets, which is actually a conservative estimate. Blackstone owns and manages over 300,000 units of rental housing in the U.S., making it the largest landlord in the country. The British newspaper The Guardian noted that Blackstone is the largest commercial landlord in history. In the past 2 decades, the Wall Street firm has quietly taken control of entire apartment blocks, care homes, student housing, railway arches, film studios, offices, hotels, logistics warehouses, and data centers. And as The Guardian wrote, Blackstone doesn't just own real estate. It owns everything, including Donald Trump, by the way. Because when these Wall Street firms fund politicians, they are investing in the politician like they invest in real estate or stocks or bonds. They know that if they fund the campaign of a politician, that politician will give them favors when they enter office. This is essentially legalized bribery, but in the US, it's entirely commonplace among candidates from both major political parties. And I want to be very clear here today because I'm not trying to defend Joe Biden by pointing out that Donald Trump is funded by Wall Street. They're both funded and owned by Wall Street. In fact, the irony is that while Donald Trump's campaign is being funded by the CEO of Blackstone, many of the top economic and financial officials in the Biden administration are from BlackRock. So here we can see that these two competing Wall Street firms are each closely allied with the major political parties. Blackstone and its billionaire founder and CEO, Steven Schwarzman, are some of the top contributors to the Republican Party, funding Donald Trump and his allies, whereas BlackRock is more closely affiliated with the Democrats and Joe Biden. Now, for people who might be confused, what is the difference between Blackstone and BlackRock? Their names are similar, but they're not the same firm. However, they both are investment management companies based in New York City. Now, BlackRock is a more traditional asset manager. What it does is it manages the assets of the rich around the world and of institutional investors, like, for instance, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. So essentially, if you are very, very wealthy, what do you do with all of your money? Well, you invest that in assets to increase your wealth. But who does that? Many of these oligarchs, these rich capitalists, are so wealthy that they invest their wealth in investment funds, and they're overseen by asset management firms, and they hire entire teams of people to invest the money of the rich in assets that bring yields so they can get wealthier and wealthier. BlackRock is the world's largest investment company, but its investments tend to be more traditional. Things like stocks which is partial ownership in a company, or bonds, which is a form of debt like government bonds or corporate bonds, which are IOUs from those institutions. So BlackRock tends to invest the wealth of the rich around the world and different institutional investors in those assets to make them wealthier. Blackstone is very similar. However, Blackstone is the world's largest alternative investment company, which means that it tends to invest the money of the rich in assets that are not stocks and bonds, things like real estate and veterinary offices and doctors' offices and retirement homes and hospitals. So Blackstone has become the world's largest landlord, and Blackstone also runs one of the world's largest private equity funds, which is where they buy entire companies, they take them over, they take on huge sums of debt for what are called leveraged buyouts. They take over companies and then they strip those companies for assets. They cut workers' wages, they lay off workers, they cut healthcare and other benefits, they reduce the quality of the care, and then they later sell those companies for parts, they make a profit, or they actually end up making those companies go bankrupt, which is what happened with major companies like Toys R Us, for instance, which was made bankrupt by private equity. I'll talk more about that later, but this is not a productive industry. This is, by definition, a parasitic industry. They don't produce anything of value. They don't produce goods that people need for their lives to be more comfortable. Instead, they suck value out of existing institutions. These asset managers on Wall Street, which emerged out of investment banks like Goldman Sachs, their job is to make the rich richer. They don't actually contribute to producing things in the real economy. And in Wall Street in general, the billionaire oligarchs who fund US politicians, they don't contribute to the real economy. They are parasites on the real economy. If you want to be very rich, not a million, if you want to be a billionaire, you don't simply invest in industrial manufacturing. You can maybe be a millionaire. If you actually want to be an oligarch, you get involved in finance, like these firms. And it should not surprise you to learn that the Blackstone CEO and founder, the billionaire oligarch Stephen Schwarzman, who is funding Donald Trump's campaign, he is the highest paid corporate executive on Wall Street, the highest paid CEO in the entire US financial services industry. Just in 1 year, in 2022, Stephen Schwarzman made $1.27 billion in compensation and in dividends. And in 2021, he made $1.1 billion in 1 year. This is in addition to all of the investments that he has made, to his other sources of wealth. This is just from the work he did at Blackstone. And again, this is the oligarch who is helping to oversee Donald Trump's presidential campaign. The Financial Times reported on this May. It noted that Donald Trump has been going around on Wall Street trying to get more and more Wall Street money to fund his campaign. Donald Trump has been tapping finance, technology, and energy billionaires for cash infusions. Trump swept through Texas to raise money from oil tycoons. And Donald Trump held a fundraiser with a hedge fund billionaire, John Paulson, who hosted a fundraiser for Trump in Florida and raised more than $50 million. Stephen Schwarzman, the Blackstone CEO, is a top ally of Donald Trump. He also helped to fund Donald Trump's previous campaigns, including he gave Trump millions of dollars for his re-election campaign in 2020. And in 2017, Donald Trump rewarded his Wall Street funder by inviting Schwarzman to chair an advisory board for Donald Trump. And then they traveled together to Saudi Arabia. And in Riyadh, the Saudi monarchy pledged to match up to $20 billion in contributions from other investors into a Blackstone infrastructure fund. So this is why these capitalist oligarchs like this Blackstone CEO, Schwarzman, this is why they fund US politicians, because it's legal corruption. They know that when the politician they are buying, they are investing in, when they win the election, that politician will help them make more and more money. So, okay, billionaire oligarchs, they pay millions of dollars funding the campaigns of politicians like Trump or Biden. And then when Trump or Biden enter the White House, they make billions of dollars in profits. The Financial Times also reported this May that Donald Trump has been getting millions of dollars from the oil and gas industry. As the FT wrote, Donald Trump swept through Texas seeking to bolster his campaign war chest with donations from oil barons and moguls controlling vast fortunes spanning sectors from sports to automotives. Trump has sought to shore up support among deep-pocketed executives in the U.S. fossil fuel industry with a pledge to rip up much of President Joe Biden's environmental and climate agenda and allow the industry to drill, baby, drill. Now, this Republican narrative that Biden and the Democrats oppose the oil and gas industry is hilariously ironic because the actual facts show the complete opposite. The Financial Times reported in February that oil and gas industry profits have nearly tripled under President Biden. There is a laughable chart in here that shows how the profits of the fossil fuel industry have absolutely skyrocketed under Joe Biden. And the FT wrote, this flies in the face of Republican arguments that the Biden administration has suffocated the industry. The article noted that U.S. production of oil and natural gas has reached new records under President Joe Biden. And in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, the net income of the fossil fuel industry was $112 billion. In the first 3 years of Biden, it was $313 billion in net income. At the same time, the collective market capitalization of the top oil and gas companies increased by 132% in the first 3 years of the Biden administration, whereas they increased just 12% in Trump's first 3 years. U.S. production has smashed records, and under Biden, in 2023, the U.S. became the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG. So this shows the hypocrisy of the Democrats and Biden, who claim to care about climate change. In reality, they are handing enormous profits to the fossil fuel industry, while the Republicans hilariously claim that Biden and the Democrats oppose fossil fuel. So here I really need to stress again, stop paying attention to this ridiculous propaganda in the Western corporate media talking about the Republicans and Democrats, Trump and Biden. Whoever wins the election, it is always Wall Street, the 1%, the capitalist oligarchy. They're the ones who always win every single presidential election in the US. They fund every candidate, and every candidate serves their economic interests. Yahoo Finance published an article this May that really summarizes perfectly how absurd it is to call Trump an anti-establishment populist. The article is titled, "Prominent Billionaires from Wall Street to Silicon Valley Are Warming Up to Donald Trump." Billionaires from coast to coast are putting their influence and money behind Donald Trump. Some have already donated millions to his campaign. Some have announced plans to do so. Trump, meanwhile, is returning the favor. He is reportedly promising to make policy changes that would help their businesses and perhaps even rely on them as advisors if he returns to the White House. And Tesla CEO Elon Musk has discussed a formal advisory role for the billionaire if Trump wins his second term in the White House. So meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And of course, this is no surprise because Donald Trump is himself a billionaire capitalist oligarch. And back in his first term, Trump cut taxes for the rich, which, by the way, massively increased U.S. government debt. But he did it on behalf of his rich friends and funders. And in April, Trump held a big fundraiser in which he raised millions of dollars from his rich friends. And he told them that if he wins his second term, he's going to extend those tax cuts for the rich. So this is how real politics gets made in the US. It's quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. You give me millions of dollars, I'll cut billions of dollars worth of taxes for you. It doesn't matter that Donald Trump and his allies claim to be anti-establishment, or the media calls him a populist. The word populist doesn't mean anything because he is funded by the same capitalist oligarchs who are also funding the other Republicans and the Democrats. Joe Biden himself made this very clear back in 2019 when he was starting his presidential campaign, and he spoke to a room full of rich donors in New York in a fancy hotel, and he reassured them, quote, nothing would fundamentally change if he won the election. He told these rich donors that Biden does not want to, quote, demonize the rich. And he said that if he wins the election, quote, no one's standard of living will change. Nothing would fundamentally change. And that's one of the few promises that Biden has kept. A poll from this January found that the wealthiest 10% of Americans own 93% of stocks. And the poll noted that this is the highest level ever recorded. And meanwhile, the bottom 50% of Americans hold just 1% of stocks. I need to repeat this because it's so incredible. The richest 10% of Americans have 93% of stocks, whereas the poorest half of Americans hold 1% of stocks. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis published similar data looking at U.S. wealth inequality this May. And keep in mind that these are conservative statistics. They noted that the top 10% of U.S. households hold 67% of total wealth. 2/3 of wealth held by the top 10% of households. Meanwhile, the poorest 50% of households, the poorest half of the country, hold 2.5% of total household wealth. And also, there is deep systemic racism in the US. Black families only have 23% of the wealth of white families, and Latino families only have 19% of the wealth of white families. So this is the reality of the so-called democracy in the US. And of course, we know that in reality, the US is not a democracy. This has been shown empirically by many academic studies. Back in 2014, there was a famous academic study done by scholars at Princeton University and Northwestern University. They looked at the data and they concluded that, quote, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. The conclusion, in the words of the BBC, the U.S. is an oligarchy, not a democracy. Studies also show that more than 90% of the candidates running for the House of Representatives who have more funding win the election, and around 80% of the candidates running for Senate who have more funding win the election. What this shows is that the US is not a democracy, or it's the best so-called democracy that money can buy. It is a capitalist oligarchy controlled by a small handful of billionaire oligarchs. And they are funding Biden, they are funding Trump, they are funding other presidential candidates. Can you guess who were the largest donors to Barack Obama's campaign when he ran for president in 2008? The second biggest donor, Goldman Sachs, the investment bank. And one of the biggest donors, JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the US, along with Citigroup, another huge bank, and of course, Google, Microsoft, other huge companies. And of course, Obama later bailed them out in the 2008 financial crisis. So they got more than their money's worth when they bought his election. And when Obama was running for his second term in the 2012 election, his competitor was the Republican Mitt Romney. And can you guess who were the largest donors to Mitt Romney's campaign? Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Credit Suisse, Citigroup, Barclays, Wells Fargo. You go down the list. And of course, Blackstone, who today is one of the main funders of Donald Trump's campaign. Wall Street is what actually runs US politics. not the people. The people do not have any impact on government policy. Quite literally, academic studies show that. There is a negligible impact of average people on U.S. government policy. The U.S. government makes policy on behalf not only of the capitalist class in the U.S., but of capitalist oligarchs all around the world. Just the U.S. alone, its stock market represents 61% of the size of the entire world's stock market. No country even remotely comes close. The US stock market is larger than all of the rest of the world's stock markets combined and then some. And who owns those stocks? Well, I already talked about how 1% of wealthy Americans own 93% of the stocks held by Americans. However, 40% of the total stocks in the US stock market actually belong to foreign capitalists, because the US government, its goal is not only to preserve and inflate the wealth of the local capitalists, but of capitalist oligarchs all around the world. And of course, because the US dollar is the global reserve currency, capitalists all around the world hold their wealth in the form of US dollar assets. So when we look at these academic studies that show that the US government is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy, I must emphasize that it's an oligarchy representing billionaire oligarchs all around the world. That's why it's important to understand that the United States is the center of the global capitalist system, and Wall Street is the heart of world capitalism. And the figureheads in the White House and in Congress are simply the political representatives of Wall Street. And in every single presidential election in the US, it is Wall Street who wins. It doesn't matter who the candidate is. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. If you like the work that we do, please like and subscribe, please share, and I will see you all next time. Thanks a lot.